A German tank that weighed 57 tons, that could destroy an enemy vehicle before the enemy vehicle was even within range to fight back, that required 5 men to operate and an entire logistics chain to keep moving, and that terrified Allied soldiers so completely that they began reporting Tiger tanks in places where no Tiger tanks existed, a psychological phenomenon that military historians eventually gave its own name. Tiger panic. The Tiger I was not the most produced tank of the war. It was not the most reliable. It was not the easiest to transport or the cheapest to build or the most fuel efficient. By almost every metric of industrial and logistical practicality, it was a disaster. And yet the Tiger I changed the nature of armored warfare so completely that every tank designed in the Western world for the next 30 years was built in response to it. You do not understand the Second World War if you do not understand the Tiger. And you do not understand the Tiger until you understand why Germany built something so extraordinary and so self-defeating at the same time. The story begins not in 1942 when the Tiger first appeared on the battlefield but in 1941 when Germany drove its tanks into the Soviet Union and encountered something that nobody in the German High Command had adequately prepared for. The T-34. The Soviet T-34 medium tank was faster than German tanks, better armored than German tanks, and armed with a gun that could destroy most German armored vehicles at combat range. The Germans had invaded the Soviet Union with the confident expectation of a quick victory and found themselves in a tank war they were not equipped to win with the vehicles they had. The Panzer III and the Panzer IV, which had been more than adequate against France and Poland, were being destroyed by a Soviet tank that German anti-tank guns could barely penetrate. The German army needed something bigger. Something that could destroy the T-34 before the T-34 could destroy it. Something that could absorb punishment that would kill any other tank on the battlefield and keep fighting. The specifications that the German army issued in response to this crisis were not modest. They wanted a tank that weighed at least 45 tons. They wanted armor thick enough to defeat any anti-tank weapon currently in the field. They wanted a gun powerful enough to destroy any tank the enemy could put against it at distances that would give the German crew the first shot. They wanted, in other words, a tank that was simply better than anything else on the battlefield in every dimension that mattered for survival and lethality. 2 companies competed to build it. Henschel und Sohn, a locomotive manufacturer based in Kassel, and Porsche, whose founder Ferdinand Porsche was so confident his design would win that he began building the hulls before the competition was decided. Henschel won. The Porsche hulls, already manufactured, were converted into tank destroyers called the Elephant, which had their own troubled history on the Eastern Front. The Henschel design was accepted by Hitler himself at a demonstration on his 53rd birthday on the 20th of April 1942, and the Tiger I entered production at the Henschel plant in Kassel shortly afterward. The production facility at Kassel was not a purpose-built tank factory. It was a locomotive plant converted to armored vehicle production, which tells you something important about the nature of German industrial capacity at this point in the war. Germany was not producing the Tiger I in the way that America was producing the Sherman, on purpose-built assembly lines optimized for volume and speed. It was building it the way a precision engineering firm builds a complex bespoke product, with skilled workers, careful tolerances, and a production rate that reflected the complexity of what was being made rather than the urgency of the military situation demanding it. The first Tigers reached the front in August 1942, near Leningrad. The debut was not auspicious. They were committed to battle prematurely, in terrain that was entirely unsuitable for heavy tanks, and several broke down before they even reached the enemy. The tanks that did engage performed adequately but not spectacularly. This first appearance gave no indication of what the Tiger would become when it was used correctly, in the open terrain and the long-range engagements for which it had been designed. That demonstration would come later, in Tunisia, in the Soviet Union, in Normandy, in circumstances that Allied tank crews would remember for the rest of their lives. The Tiger I's specifications were extraordinary by the standards of any tank produced during the Second World War. Its armor was 88 mm thick on the front hull and turret, which was not merely thick by 1942 standards but effectively impenetrable by most Allied anti-tank weapons at any combat range those weapons were likely to encounter in the field. The sides were 62 mm. Even the rear was a minimum of 82 mm. The Tiger was not just armored in the front, which was the conventional approach to tank protection. It was armored all around, in recognition of the reality of modern tank combat where the enemy was rarely considerate enough to attack only from directly ahead. The gun was the 8.8 cm kilowatt K36, a weapon derived from the famous 88mm anti-aircraft gun that German forces had been using with devastating effect against Allied tanks since the North African campaign. The tank version was capable of penetrating 112mm of armor at 1,000 meters. To put that in practical terms, it could destroy a Sherman tank at nearly 2,000 meters, well beyond the range at which the Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. In a direct confrontation on flat ground, the Tiger did not just have an advantage. It had a zone of safety, a range at which it could destroy the Sherman while remaining completely immune to return fire. This range advantage was not theoretical. It was demonstrated repeatedly in combat, and it was the primary source of the psychological terror that the Tiger generated in Allied tank crews. A Sherman crew that spotted a Tiger at 1,500 meters faced an immediate and brutal calculation. The Tiger's crew could see them. The Tiger's gun could kill them. Their own gun could not kill the Tiger at that range. The only options were to retreat, to find cover, or to attempt to close the range enough to have a chance at the Tiger's flanks or rear. Each of these options carried its own risk. Retreat exposed the tank to the Tiger's fire during the withdrawal. Finding cover required moving in a direction that the Tiger's crew was watching. Closing the range meant driving toward a vehicle that could destroy you at any point during the approach. Allied tank commanders developed tactical doctrines specifically designed to address this problem, doctrines that typically involved sacrificing multiple Shermans to distract and flank a single Tiger, an exchange that was militarily effective but that carried an obvious and terrible human cost. The interior of the Tiger was, by the standards of 1942 tank design, spacious and well organized. The five-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, had more room than the crews of most competing tanks, which improved their effectiveness in combat and reduced the exhaustion that cramped conditions imposed on the men operating other vehicles. The commander's position was equipped with a cupola that gave excellent all-round vision, a significant tactical advantage in the confused conditions of armored combat where seeing the battlefield clearly was often the difference between surviving an engagement and not. The Tiger's failures were as significant as its capabilities, and understanding them is essential to understanding why a tank that was superior to almost everything it faced in direct combat still ended up on the losing side of the war. The first and most fundamental failure was weight. 57 tons was an extraordinary burden to place on any vehicle expected to operate on the roads and bridges of war-torn Europe. The Tiger regularly broke through bridges that were rated to carry far lighter vehicles. It required special railway flat cars for transport. It could not cross most pontoon bridges. Moving a Tiger from one part of the front to another was a logistical operation that consumed resources and time out of all proportion to the tactical benefit of having the tank in a new location. The second failure was mechanical reliability. The Tiger's suspension system, which used interleaved road wheels in a design that provided excellent cross-country performance on firm ground, became catastrophically problematic in the mud of the Eastern Front, where the gaps between the wheels would fill with mud that froze overnight in the Russian winter, locking the entire running gear solid by morning. German crews arriving for an engagement would find their Tigers immobile, not because they had been hit by enemy fire but because the temperature had dropped overnight and the mud between their road wheels had turned to ice. The third failure was production numbers. Germany produced approximately 1,347 Tiger I tanks between August 1942 and August 1944. In the same period, the United States produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks. The Soviet Union produced approximately 57,000 T-34s. The Tiger was so difficult and so expensive to build that Germany could never produce it in numbers sufficient to change the outcome of the war. For every Tiger on the battlefield there were dozens of Shermans and T-34s. The Tiger could destroy them faster than they could destroy Tigers, but it could not destroy them faster than the American and Soviet industrial machines could replace them. The mathematics of industrial warfare were always going to defeat the mathematics of individual vehicle superiority, and the Tiger, magnificent as it was in one-to-one combat, was always fighting a war of attrition it could not win. The fuel consumption was a related problem. The Tiger's Maybach HL-230 engine consumed fuel at a rate that the German logistical system, already stretched to breaking point by 1943, could not consistently sustain. Tigers ran out of fuel and were abandoned by their crews. Entire units were immobilized for days waiting for fuel deliveries that were delayed by Allied air attacks on German supply lines. The most feared tank in the world spent significant portions of the war sitting motionless beside roads in France and the Soviet Union because the trucks carrying its fuel had been destroyed by aircraft that it could not defend itself against. The Tiger's combat record, within the specific conditions where it could operate effectively, was extraordinary. Michael Wittmann is the most celebrated of the Tiger commanders, a German SS officer whose actions at the Battle of Villers-Bocage in Normandy on 13 June 1944 remain one of the most remarkable individual tank actions in the history of armored warfare. In approximately 15 minutes, Wittmann's Tiger destroyed a column of British armored vehicles on a road in Normandy, killing or disabling multiple tanks, half-tracks, and armored cars in a single aggressive attack that disrupted an entire British operation. The action was real, documented on both sides, and it demonstrated what a Tiger in the hands of an experienced crew in suitable terrain could do to an unprepared enemy. Wittmann was credited with destroying over 138 enemy tanks during the war, a figure that historians have scrutinized and broadly accepted as approximately accurate. He was killed in August 1944, his Tiger destroyed by a combination of accounts that remain disputed, either by a British Firefly tank, a Canadian anti-tank gun, or a rocket from a Typhoon aircraft. The uncertainty itself reflecting the chaos of the Normandy campaign in which even the most experienced Tiger crews were being hunted simultaneously by multiple weapons systems that the Allies were deploying in increasing numbers. The Tiger I was replaced in German service by the Tiger II, also known as the King Tiger, which entered production in 1944 and represented a further escalation of the same design philosophy. The Tiger II was even heavier at 68 tons, even better armed with a longer and more powerful version of the 88mm gun. It was also even more mechanically unreliable, even more fuel-hungry, and produced in even smaller numbers. Germany built approximately 489 King Tigers. The logic of escalating individual vehicle capability at the cost of production numbers and mechanical reliability had reached its terminal point. The King Tiger was so heavy that it broke down so frequently that it was often more of a liability than an asset, and several were abandoned by their crews not because they had been defeated in combat but because they had simply stopped working and could not be repaired in the field. The answer to the Tiger that the Allies eventually developed came in several forms. The Soviet Union responded with the IS-2 heavy tank, which mounted a 122mm gun capable of destroying a Tiger at combat range, and with tactical doctrines that used overwhelming numbers to saturate Tiger crews with targets faster than they could engage them. The British developed the Sherman Firefly, a modified Sherman equipped with the 17-pounder gun that could penetrate Tiger armor at combat range, giving Allied tank crews a vehicle that could finally fight back on something approaching equal terms. The Americans developed the M26 Pershing, a heavy tank that entered service in early 1945 and that was designed from the ground up as a Tiger killing machine. The psychological legacy of the Tiger outlasted the war itself. Allied tank designers for decades after 1945 used the Tiger as the benchmark against which new designs were measured. The British Centurion, the American M60, the Soviet T-54, all of them were built with the lessons of facing the Tiger incorporated into their design philosophy. The Tiger had demonstrated that a tank with superior gun and superior armor could dominate the battlefield in ways that forced the entire opposing military establishment to rethink its approach to armored warfare. That lesson did not end in 1945. It is still being applied in the design of modern main battle tanks today. Several Tiger tanks survive in museums around the world. The most famous is Tiger 131, held at the Tank Museum in Bovington in England, which is the only fully operational Tiger I in the world. It was captured in Tunisia in April 1943 when a Churchill tank scored a hit that jammed the turret, forcing the crew to abandon it. It is the oldest surviving Tiger, preserved in running condition, and it is driven periodically for public demonstrations that draw crowds who want to see and hear what the most feared tank of the Second World War actually looked and sounded like in operation. There are also Tigers at the Musée des Blindes in Sorma in France, at the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia, at the Ordnance Museum in the United States, and at other military museums across Europe. Each of these surviving examples represents a vehicle that somehow escaped the fate of the vast majority of Tigers, which were destroyed in combat, broken down and abandoned, or scrapped after the war by the Allied forces that captured them. Out of 1,347 Tiger I tanks produced, fewer than 10 survive. The attrition rate of the war consumed the rest. The Tiger tank is remembered today not primarily as a weapon that helped Germany win the war, because it did not help Germany win the war. It is remembered as the most impressive demonstration of what happens when engineering ambition is placed ahead of industrial practicality, when the pursuit of absolute battlefield superiority in individual vehicle performance comes at the cost of the numbers and the reliability that modern industrial warfare actually requires. The Tiger was technically magnificent and strategically irrelevant. It won every battle it should have won and lost the war anyway. The lesson of the Tiger is one that military planners have had to relearn in every conflict since 1945. Capability matters. But quantity has a quality all its own. The Sherman was inferior to the Tiger in almost every direct performance metric. The Sherman also won the war. The Tiger lost it. And the gap between those two outcomes, the gap between individual excellence and industrial mass, between engineering perfection and logistical sustainability, is the gap that the Tiger tank tears open every time someone looks at it honestly. The crews who operated Tigers knew this. The best of them, the experienced veterans of the Eastern Front and North Africa, understood that their extraordinary vehicle was buying time rather than changing outcomes, that the production numbers and the fuel shortages and the mechanical failures were going to overwhelm whatever tactical superiority the Tiger's gun and armor provided. They fought anyway, with the specific courage of men who understand that the situation is lost and who have decided that this understanding is not a reason to stop fighting. The Tiger was their weapon. It was the best weapon anyone had built by the standards of its time. It was not enough. And the story of why it was not enough is also the story of why Germany lost the Second World War. Not because German engineering was inferior. Because German industrial capacity, stretched across a war on multiple fronts against enemies with vastly greater resources, could not produce enough of the extraordinary to defeat the ordinary produced in overwhelming numbers. The Tiger sits in the museum at Bovington. It starts when they turn the key. It sounds like a machine that was built to last forever. It was built, in the end, to last about 2 years. That gap between the sound and the reality is the Tiger eye in one detail. The most impressive failure in the history of armored warfare. And the most honest lesson the Second World War has to teach anyone willing to hear it.